The morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Cooper's perfectly manicured lawn as he slowly rocked in his weathered wooden chair on the front porch. At 93 years old, his body might have aged, but his mind remained sharp as ever. His wrinkled hands, marked with age spots, gently rested on his knees as he watched the quiet street of Cedar Grove turn into something he barely recognized anymore. Harold had lived in this house for over 6 decades, ever since returning from World War II with a chest full of medals and memories he rarely spoke about. The neighborhood had always been peaceful, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and looked out for one another. But things had started to change 3 months ago when the old Wilson's hardware store, just 2 blocks down, was converted into a biker bar called the Steel Haven. Every morning, Harold followed the same routine he'd maintained since his wife Martha passed away 5 years ago. He would wake up at exactly 6:30 a.m., make his bed with military precision, and put on a clean, pressed button-down shirt. Today was no different as he walked to his garage, where his pride and joy waited. A 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, gleaming in powder blue and chrome, maintained in perfect condition. "Morning, old friend," Harold whispered to the car, running his hand along its smooth surface. This car had been with him through everything: Martha's final days, his children's weddings, and countless Sunday drives. It was more than just a vehicle, it was a connection to his past. The drive to Joe's Diner took exactly 7 minutes, just as it had for the past 20 years. The bell above the door chimed as Harold entered, and Sally, the waitress who'd been serving him for the last decade, already had his usual order ready: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and black coffee. "Morning, Mr. Cooper," Sally called out cheerfully, her red hair bouncing as she moved between tables. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Harold nodded with a gentle smile, settling into his regular booth by the window. From here, he could watch the town wake up, just as he always had. But lately, the view had changed. Instead of seeing Mrs. Peterson walking her poodle or the Anderson kids heading to school, he now watched groups of leather-clad bikers roaring past, their motorcycles breaking the morning peace. As Harold sipped his coffee, his hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from worry. Last night, the noise from the Steel Haven had kept him awake until 3 a.m. The rumbling of motorcycles, loud music, and raucous laughter had echoed through his usually quiet street. He'd called the police twice, but they seemed reluctant to do anything about it. "More coffee, Mr. Cooper?" Sally asked, noticing his distant look. "Yes, please, Sally," he replied, his voice soft but clear. "And how's that grandson of yours doing in college?" Sally beamed. "Oh, he's doing great. Just made the dean's list. Says those math tutorials you gave him really helped." Harold smiled, remembering the afternoons spent helping Sally's grandson with algebra. He had been a mathematics teacher before the war, though few people knew that now. Most just saw him as the old man in the big house on Cedar Grove. After finishing his breakfast, Harold drove home, his heart sinking as he approached his house. 3 motorcycles were parked partially blocking his driveway, their owners nowhere in sight. He had to maneuver carefully to get his Chevrolet into the garage, a task that was becoming increasingly difficult with his aging eyes. As he stepped out of his car, Harold heard loud laughter from the Steel Haven's direction. A group of bikers was gathering, even though it was barely 9 a.m. Their leather vests displayed a logo: a steel raven with burning red eyes. One of them caught Harold looking and nudged his friends, pointing and snickering. Inside his house, Harold walked to his study, where photographs of his life covered the walls. His eyes fixed on one in particular, a young man in military uniform standing proudly next to a motorcycle. Few people knew about that part of his life, about the missions he'd led, about the lives he'd saved. He touched the frame gently, remembering the feeling of wind in his hair and the power of the machine beneath him. A sudden roar of motorcycles outside made him flinch. Harold looked out his window at the group of bikers now gathering on his street. They were young, strong, and showed no respect for the peace of the neighborhood he called home for so long. Little did they know, the quiet old man they were taunting had faced far worse enemies than them, and he wasn't done fighting yet. The problem started small, but day by day, they grew worse. Harold noticed how the bikers would stare at him whenever he drove past the Steel Haven, their eyes following his classic Chevrolet with a mix of mockery and contempt. It wasn't just the noise anymore, there was something more threatening in the air. One Tuesday morning, Harold stepped out to get his mail and found cigarette butts scattered across his carefully tended flower beds. The petunias that Martha had loved so much were crushed, clearly trampled by heavy boots. His hands shook as he picked up the destroyed flowers, but not from fear, from anger. "Hey, old-timer," a rough voice called out. Harold looked up to see three members of the Steel Ravens approaching. The one in front, a tall man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his arms, seemed to be their leader. "Nice garden you got there. Be a shame if something happened to it." Harold stood straight, his military bearing showing through despite his age. "I'd appreciate it if you keep off my property," he said firmly, his voice steady. The bikers laughed. "Or what? You'll call the cops again?" The leader sneered. "They don't care about your complaints, old man. Times are changing. Maybe you should think about moving to one of those old folks' homes." Just then, Mrs. Rodriguez from next door came out with her camera phone. "Is everything okay, Mr. Cooper?" she called, clearly recording the interaction. The bikers noticed too, and after exchanging glances, they backed away, making rude gestures as they left. That evening, Harold sat in his study, looking through old photo albums. His fingers traced over pictures of his younger self, a strong, confident soldier who had served his country proudly. The sound of motorcycles roaring past his house made him close his eyes in frustration. The next morning brought worse news. Harold walked to his garage and found his heart nearly stopping at the sight. Someone had scratched the word "Leave" across the hood of his beloved Chevrolet. The pristine powder blue paint job, which he had maintained so carefully for decades, was ruined. Officer Jenkins arrived 30 minutes later, but his response wasn't encouraging. "Look, Mr. Cooper," he said, flipping his notebook closed. "We both know who did this. Without proof, there's not much we can do. These guys, they're not the type you want to mess with." "So I should just let them drive me out of my own home?" Harold asked, his voice tight with emotion. The officer looked uncomfortable. Maybe it would be safer if you considered other options. Your daughter in Florida, doesn't she want you to move closer to her?" After the officer left, Harold sat in his kitchen, feeling more alone than ever. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes floating in the air. The house seemed too quiet, too empty. He missed Martha more than ever in moments like these. The mail arrived, and among the bills and advertisements was a letter from his grandson, Tommy. Inside was a recent photo of Tommy with his college rowing team, along with a letter sharing his latest adventures. Harold smiled at the photo, but his smile faded as he heard more motorcycles approaching. Through his window, he watched as 5 bikes parked directly in front of his house. The riders were removing their helmets, laughing and talking loudly. One of them looked straight at Harold's window and made a threatening gesture. Harold's hands clenched into fists. He had fought real battles, faced real enemies. These bullies thought they could intimidate a veteran who had seen the worst of humanity during the war. His eyes drifted to the garage door, thinking about what lay hidden under the old tarps in the back corner. The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. It was Tommy. "Grandpa, I'm coming to visit this weekend. I found something amazing in Mom's attic, your old military photos and documents. Why didn't you ever tell me you were a motorcycle scout in the war?" Harold's eyes widened. He hadn't thought about those days in years. The memories came flooding back. The rumble of his Indian Scout motorcycle, the dangerous missions behind enemy lines, the respect he'd earned from his fellow soldiers. "Tommy," Harold said slowly, a plan forming in his mind, "when you come, bring those photos with you, and bring my old leather jacket too. I think it's time to show these boys what a real rider looks like." For the first time in weeks, a genuine smile crossed Harold's face. The Steel Ravens had no idea who they were dealing with, but they were about to find out. Tommy arrived early Saturday morning, carrying a dusty cardboard box filled with memories. Harold watched from his porch as his grandson's car pulled into the driveway, carefully avoiding the motorcycles that still plagued the street. At 22, Tommy looked so much like Harold had at that age, tall, strong, with the same determined set to his jaw. "Grandpa," Tommy called out, rushing up the steps with the box. "You won't believe what I found in Mom's attic. Why didn't you ever tell us about any of this?" Inside, they spread the contents of the box across Harold's dining room table. Yellowed photographs showed a young Harold in his military uniform, standing proudly next to a powerful Indian Scout motorcycle. There were official documents, medals, and most importantly, his old leather jacket, still supple despite decades in storage. "This is incredible," Tommy said, holding up a photograph of Harold leading a group of motorcycle scouts through a French village. "You were a hero, Grandpa. These mission reports. You led some of the most dangerous reconnaissance operations of the war." Harold touched the old leather jacket gently. "That was a long time ago, son. Another life." Just then, the roar of motorcycles interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they watched as more steel ravens arrived, their bikes deliberately revving louder as they passed Harold's house. Tommy's face darkened with anger. "I've heard about what they've been doing," Tommy said. "Mom's worried sick about you, but she doesn't know about this, does she? About your past?" Harold shook his head. "I never talked much about the war. After your grandmother passed, I packed everything away, but seeing these photos now..." Tommy picked up another photograph, this one showing Harold performing a complex motorcycle maneuver during training. "These skills, this experience, you were an expert rider, Grandpa. Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" A small smile crossed Harold's face. "Follow me," he said, standing up with new energy in his movements. He led Tommy to the garage, past his scratched Chevrolet, to the far corner where several old tarps covered mysterious shapes. Together, they pulled back the tarps, revealing a sight that made Tommy gasp. There, perfectly preserved, sat Harold's 1942 Indian Scout motorcycle. The machine was immaculate, its chrome still gleaming, its leather seat well oiled. "Every Sunday for 40 years, I've maintained it," Harold explained, running his hand along the familiar handlebars. "Your grandmother used to say I was silly, keeping it in such perfect condition, but somehow I could never let it go." Tommy walked around the motorcycle in awe. "Does it still run?" "Like the day I brought it home," Harold replied. He reached for the key that had hung on a hook nearby for decades. "Want to hear her purr?" The motorcycle started on the first try, its engines rumbled deep and powerful, different from the harsh roars of the modern bikes outside. The sound brought back a flood of memories for Harold: midnight missions across enemy lines, the trust of his fellow scouts, the respect he'd earned through skill and courage. As if on cue, loud laughter erupted from outside. Through the garage windows, they could see several Steel Ravens members lounging against their bikes, pointing at Harold's house and making rude gestures. "They have no idea who they're dealing with," Tommy said, looking at his grandfather with new eyes. "These guys think they're tough. They've never seen what real courage looks like." Harold stood straighter, years seeming to fall away from his shoulders. He picked up his old leather jacket from where Tommy had brought it to the garage. The leather was still soft, the patches and insignia still clear, marks of honor from a time when he faced real dangers, real challenges. "Tomorrow's Sunday," Harold said, his voice firm. "Usually, that's when they're all here, showing off their riding skills in front of the bar." He looked at his grandson with a glint in his eye. "What do you say we give them a little history lesson?" Tommy grinned. "I'll help you polish up the bike tonight. And Grandpa?" He held up one of the old photographs. "Wear your medals too. Let them see exactly who they've been disrespecting." As they worked together cleaning and preparing the motorcycle, the noise from outside seemed less threatening. Harold felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the anticipation of action, the quiet confidence of someone who knew his own strength. The Steel Ravens thought they were dealing with a helpless old man. Tomorrow, they would learn just how wrong they were. Sunday dawned bright and clear. Harold woke before his alarm, feeling a familiar tension in his stomach, the same feeling he'd had before important missions during the war. He went through his morning routine with military precision, but today was different. Instead of his usual button-down shirt, he put on a crisp white t-shirt, and over it, his old leather jacket. The leather had been conditioned and polished until it glowed, and his military patches caught the morning light. Tommy had stayed overnight, and Harold could hear him in the garage, doing final checks on the Indian Scout. They had worked late into the night, though the motorcycle hardly needed it. Harold's decades of meticulous maintenance had kept it in perfect condition. As Harold pinned his medals to his jacket, his hands were steady. Through his bedroom window, he could already hear motorcycles arriving at the Steel Haven. Every Sunday morning, the Steel Ravens gathered to show off their riding skills, performing tricks and stunts for their admirers. The noise had once been a source of frustration for Harold. Today, it was a call to action. "Grandpa, you got to see this," Tommy called from outside. Harold walked to his front porch and wasn't surprised to see a larger crowd than usual gathering. Word had spread through the neighborhood that something was going to happen. Mrs. Rodriguez was there with her camera phone ready, and even Officer Jenkins had parked his patrol car nearby, watching with curious eyes. The Steel Ravens were out in force, their bikes lined up along the street. Their leader, the bearded man who had threatened Harold earlier that week, was performing wheelies to the cheers of his followers. The scratches they had left on Harold's Chevrolet seemed to gleam in the morning sun, a reminder of their disrespect. "Ready?" Tommy asked, wheeling the Indian Scout out of the garage. The vintage motorcycle drew immediate attention. Its classic lines and gleaming chrome spoke of a different era, a time when machines were built with care and precision. Harold nodded, feeling the weight of his medals on his chest. As he walked down his driveway, conversations began to quiet. The Steel Ravens stopped their stunts, turning to watch the old man approaching the vintage motorcycle. "Hey, look!" one of them shouted. "Grandpa's got himself a toy." Laughter rippled through their group, but it died quickly as Harold swung his leg over the bike with practiced ease. The Indian Scout roared to life at his touch, its engine's deep rumble distinctly different from the high-pitched whine of modern motorcycles. Harold took a moment to feel the familiar vibration, remembering countless missions where his life had depended on this very machine. Tommy stepped back, holding up one of the old photographs so others could see. In the crowd, phones were raised to record what was happening. The Steel Ravens leader stepped forward, a mocking smile on his face. "Nice antique," he sneered. "Maybe you should donate it to a museum before you hurt yourself." Harold didn't respond. Instead, he eased the motorcycle forward, moving with a confidence that made the smiles fade from the younger riders' faces. Then, without warning, he opened up the throttle. What happened next would be talked about in the neighborhood for years to come. The 93-year-old veteran put his motorcycle through maneuvers that left the crowd gasping. Figures of 8 executed with perfect precision, tight turns that seemed to defy physics, and controlled slides that showed complete mastery over the machine. These weren't showy stunts meant to impress. These were the skilled movements of someone who had once ridden through enemy territory where a single mistake meant death. Each maneuver was performed with military precision, each turn calculated and perfect. The Steel Ravens watched in stunned silence. Their leader's face had lost its mocking expression, replaced by something that looked like respect. Officer Jenkins was smiling and shaking his head in amazement. As Harold brought the motorcycle to a perfect stop in front of his house, the neighborhood erupted in applause. Mrs. Rodriguez was crying and cheering at the same time. Tommy stood grinning proudly, still holding the old photograph that now made perfect sense to everyone who had witnessed Harold's ride. But Harold wasn't finished. He turned the Indian Scout toward the group of Steel Ravens, its engine purring smoothly. The younger riders parted as he approached, their earlier bravado replaced by something like awe. He stopped in front of their leader and finally spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Son, why don't we have a talk about what it really means to be a rider?" The bearded man looked at Harold's medals, then at the perfectly controlled vintage motorcycle, and slowly nodded. The dynamic had shifted, and everyone knew it. The real lesson was about to begin. The Steel Ravens gathered around Harold as he dismounted his Indian Scout with the same grace he'd shown while riding it. Their leader, who introduced himself as Mike, stood closest, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine curiosity. The man's eyes kept moving between Harold's medals and the vintage motorcycle that had just outperformed their modern machines. "Where did you learn to ride like that?" Mike asked, his voice carrying a new note of respect. Harold took off his leather jacket, pointing to a particular patch that showed a motorcycle with wings. 82nd Airborne Reconnaissance Unit, he said. "We were motorcycle scouts during World War II. Our missions involved riding behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence, and getting out alive. No room for mistakes or showing off." Tommy started passing around the old photographs, and the bikers crowded to see them. Their expressions changed as they saw young Harold leading missions, riding through dangerous territories, and training other scouts. One photo showed him receiving a medal for a particularly dangerous mission where he'd saved 3 fellow scouts while under heavy fire. "You mean you actually rode that bike in combat?" a younger member asked, looking at the Indian Scout with new appreciation. Harold nodded. "This exact machine. She got me through some of the worst moments of the war. Back then, it wasn't about noise or showing off. It was about skill, precision, and taking care of your machine because your life depended on it. Mike ran his hand along the Indian Scout's fuel tank, noting the perfect condition. "I've never seen a vintage bike maintained this well," he admitted. "Must have taken years of work." "Every Sunday," Harold said. "While you boys were out here making noise, I was in my garage maintaining this bike." A good rider respects his machine, respects his neighbors, and respects himself. The words hit home. Several of the younger riders looked down, suddenly aware of their behavior over the past months. Mrs. Rodriguez, who was still recording everything on her phone, nodded approvingly. "Sir," Mike said, clearing his throat, "about your car. The scratches. We were out of line." Before Harold could respond, one of the younger ravens stepped forward. "I can fix that," he said quickly. "I work at an auto body shop. Give me a weekend, and I'll have your Chevy looking better than new. No charge." Harold studied the young man's face, seeing genuine remorse. "I'd appreciate that," he said. Then he turned to Mike. "You know, when I was leading scouts, we had a code. We looked out for each other, for our community. Real riders aren't bullies, they're protectors." Mike's expression changed as understanding dawned. He looked at his club members, then back at Harold. Would you be willing to teach us some of those riding techniques? The precision stuff, I mean. Not the combat parts, obviously, but the skill riding?" Harold couldn't help but smile. This was what he'd hoped for, not just to show them up, but to make a real connection. "On one condition," he said. "The late-night noise stops. You show respect for the neighborhood." "Deal. Deal," Mike said immediately, extending his hand. Harold shook it firmly. Tommy, who had been watching proudly, spoke up. "You know, Grandpa, the Steel Havens parking lot would make a great practice area on Sunday mornings. Better than the street." The transformation over the next hour was remarkable. Harold found himself surrounded by eager listeners as he explained the principles of precision riding. He demonstrated techniques for smooth cornering, efficient braking, and maintaining perfect balance at low speeds. The Ravens were surprised to learn that true skill wasn't about speed or noise, but control and respect for the machine. Officer Jenkins, who had watched the whole scene unfold, walked over to Harold. "Well, Mr. Cooper, looks like you've solved our neighborhood problem better than the police ever could," he said with a smile. As the morning went on, neighbors who had been afraid to complain about the bikers began coming out of their houses. They watched in amazement as the once rowdy group listened intently to Harold's instructions, practicing slow-speed maneuvers in the parking lot with intense concentration. Mrs. Rodriguez brought out coffee and her famous homemade cookies for everyone as Harold watched the scene. Bikers chatting with neighbors, his grandson sharing more war stories with an attentive audience, and Mike carefully taking notes on proper motorcycle maintenance. He felt a deep satisfaction. Sometimes, the best way to fight wasn't with fists or angry words, but with wisdom, skill, and an opportunity for redemption. The war had taught him that, and now, decades later, the lesson was still true. 1 week after Harold's remarkable demonstration, the Steel Haven had undergone a noticeable transformation. Gone were the late-night disturbances and disrespectful behavior. Instead, every morning, Harold found members of the Steel Ravens practicing the precise riding techniques he'd taught them in the parking lot. That Sunday morning, as Harold supervised another training session, Mike approached him with an old photograph in his trembling hands. His usual confident demeanor was replaced by an emotional uncertainty that caught Harold's attention immediately. "Mr. Cooper," Mike said, his voice unusually soft, "my mother sent me this after I told her about you." He held out the photograph, and Harold's eyes widened in recognition. The picture showed a much younger Harold standing next to another soldier, both leaning against their Indian Scout motorcycles. Harold remembered that day clearly. It was taken just before a dangerous reconnaissance mission in France. "That's Jimmy Morrison," Harold said quietly, pointing to the other soldier. "One of the best scouts I ever trained. We rode together for months. Lost track of him after the war, though." Mike's voice cracked as he spoke. "That's my grandfather." The revelation hit Harold like a physical force. He looked more closely at Mike's face, and suddenly the resemblance was clear. The same determined jaw, the same intense eyes. Jimmy Morrison had been one of his closest friends during the war, a natural rider who had saved Harold's life more than once. Your grandfather. Harold had to sit down on a nearby bench. Jimmy was a hero. Did he ever tell you about the mission in Normandy, when we had to ride through a minefield to deliver crucial intelligence? Mike shook his head, sitting beside Harold. He never talked about the war. Died when I was 12. But Mom says he kept his riding jacket until the day he passed, with all his patches and medals still on it. The other ravens gathered around as Harold began sharing stories about their leader's grandfather. He told them about Jimmy's courage, his skill on a motorcycle, and his unwavering loyalty to his fellow scouts. Mike listened intently, occasionally wiping his eyes, learning about a side of his grandfather he'd never known. You know what's strange? Harold said, looking at Mike. Jimmy always used to say that a motorcycle gang isn't about causing trouble. It's about brotherhood, about having each other's backs, just like our scout unit. Mike stood up suddenly, walking to his motorcycle. He returned with his Steel Raven's leather vest in his hands. Mr. Cooper, he said formally, on behalf of the Steel Ravens, I want to make you an honorary member. Not just because of who you are, but because of who you were to my grandfather. The other ravens nodded enthusiastically. Harold accepted the vest with dignity, noticing that they had already added a special patch, a World War II motorcycle scout insignia they must have had custom made. And there's something else, Mike continued. We've been talking, and we'd like to make some changes to the Steel Haven. First, we're changing our Friday nights to Veterans Nights. Any veteran rides free, and we'll display military service photographs on the walls, starting with yours and my grandfather's. Harold felt his eyes getting moist. Jimmy would have liked that, he said softly. Tommy, who had become a regular at these Sunday sessions, stepped forward with his phone. And wait till you see this, Grandpa. Show him, Mike. Mike grinned and pulled out some papers. We've registered the Steel Ravens for the National Veterans Motorcycle Support Network. We'll be doing charity rides for veterans' causes, escort services for military funerals, and holiday toy drives for veterans' families. The transformation was complete. The gang that had once terrorized the neighborhood was becoming something their community could be proud of. Harold looked around at the young faces, seeing not troublemakers anymore, but men finding their way to a noble purpose. Your grandfather once told me, Harold said to Mike, that the measure of a man isn't in how tough he acts, but in how he uses his strength to help others. Looks like that wisdom ran in the family, it just needed some time to surface. As the morning sun rose higher, the sound of motorcycles filled the air again. But now, instead of aggressive revving, it was the disciplined purr of machines being ridden with skill and respect. Leading them was Harold on his Indian Scout, with Mike riding beside him in the position his grandfather had once occupied. The neighborhood had changed, and so had the Steel Ravens. Sometimes, Harold realized, the best kind of victory wasn't in defeating an enemy, but in turning them into friends. 6 months after Harold's first encounter with the Steel Ravens, Cedar Grove was a different place. The Steel Haven, once considered a neighborhood nuisance, had become a respected community center. The walls that had once been covered with intimidating biker imagery now displayed proud military photographs, including the cherished picture of young Harold and Jimmy Morrison. One crisp Saturday morning, Harold sat in his usual spot on the porch, drinking coffee and watching the neighborhood come alive. Instead of the chaos that had once ruled the streets, he saw members of the Steel Ravens helping Mrs. Rodriguez carry her groceries. Another group was fixing old Mr. Johnson's fence, their motorcycles parked neatly in designated spots. Mike pulled up in front of Harold's house, his motorcycle purring quietly. No more unnecessary revving. He carried a newspaper in his hand and wore an excited expression. Mr. Cooper, he called out, taking the porch steps 2 at a time. We made the front page. The local newspaper featured a large photograph of Harold and the Steel Ravens at their recent Veterans Support Ride. The event had raised over $50,000 for the local VA hospital. In the picture, Harold sat proudly on his Indian Scout, surrounded by the leather-clad riders who now treated him like a beloved father figure. That's not all, Mike said, pulling out an official-looking letter. Remember that application we submitted? The Steel Ravens have been officially recognized as the state's leading veteran support motorcycle club. We're getting calls from other clubs asking how to start similar programs. Harold smiled, remembering how different things had been just months ago. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but through consistent effort and genuine change. The Steel Ravens had taken his lessons about respect and brotherhood to heart. Inside the Steel Haven, which now closed promptly at 10 p.m. out of respect for the neighbors, a special corner had been dedicated as the Cooper Morrison Memorial Wall. It displayed photographs and stories of motorcycle scouts from World War II, teaching visitors about the brave men who had ridden their machines into danger to save others. Tommy, who now visited every weekend to help with the veterans programs, arrived with more good news. "Grandpa, you won't believe this. The National World War II Museum heard about your story. They want to do a special exhibition about motorcycle scouts, featuring your Indian scout and your stories." The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. Mrs. Rodriguez organized an impromptu celebration in her backyard. Neighbors who had once kept their doors locked when bikers were around now mingled freely with the Steel Ravens, sharing food and stories. Officer Jenkins stopped by, now a regular friend rather than a concerned policeman. "You know, Mr. Cooper," he said, "our department's getting requests from other cities about how you turned this situation around. You've created a model for community transformation." Later that afternoon, as Harold conducted his weekly motorcycle maintenance class in the Steel Haven's parking lot, he noticed something remarkable. Among the leather-clad bikers were several young veterans, recently returned from service, who had found a supportive brotherhood among the Steel Ravens. One young Marine, still struggling with civilian life, spoke up during the class. "Sir," he said to Harold, "finding this group, it's given me a purpose again. The way you guys combine riding with helping other vets, it's making a real difference." Mike, standing nearby, nodded in agreement. "That's what my grandfather and Mr. Cooper understood back in the war," he said. "It's not about the machines. It's about the people who ride them and how we take care of each other." As the sun began to set, Harold looked around at what his community had become. Children played safely in the streets again, but now they waved excitedly whenever the Steel Ravens rode past. The bikers had become guardians of the neighborhood rather than its tormentors. In his garage, Harold's Chevrolet gleamed with its new paint job, better than new, just as promised. Next to it, his Indian scout stood ready for the next Sunday ride, which now typically included escorting veteran funeral processions or leading charity events. Tommy came out to join him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You know, Grandpa," he said, "when I found those old photographs, I never imagined they'd lead to all this." Harold accepted the coffee with a smile. "Sometimes," he replied, "the best victories are the ones where everyone wins. Your grandmother used to say that change happens in hearts first, then in actions." As if to emphasize his words, the sound of motorcycles approached, but now, instead of bringing dread, it brought smiles to the faces of everyone in Cedar Grove. The Steel Ravens were returning from another veteran support mission, riding with the precision and respect that Harold had taught them, their leather jackets bearing both their club insignia and their commitment to service. 1 year after Harold's unforgettable demonstration, Cedar Grove hosted a special celebration. The occasion was Harold's 94th birthday, but it had become much more than that. The entire neighborhood gathered at the Steel Haven, which had been transformed for the event with patriotic decorations and vintage motorcycle displays. The parking lot, once a source of neighborhood tension, was now filled with perfectly aligned motorcycles belonging to Steel Ravens chapters from across the state. Each bike bore the new club emblem, a Steel Raven carrying an American flag, with the words "Honoring Veterans, Serving Community" beneath it. Inside, the walls of the Steel Haven told a story of transformation. Photos chronicled the journey: Harold's first ride that changed everything, the first Veterans Night, charity rides, community service projects, and countless moments of brotherhood between young bikers and aging veterans. Mike stood at the podium, his voice carrying emotion as he addressed the gathered crowd. "1 year ago, we were lost," he said, looking at Harold, who sat in a place of honor. "We thought being tough meant making others feel small. Mr. Cooper didn't just teach us about riding, he taught us about honor, respect, and true brotherhood." The mayor stepped forward next, presenting Harold with a key to the city. "Mr. Cooper's story reminds us that it's never too late to make a difference," she announced. The Steel Ravens program has become a national model for veteran support and community engagement. 10 other cities have already started similar initiatives. Tommy, who had recently completed his college degree, shared his own news. He was starting a non-profit organization called Scouts Honor, dedicated to connecting motorcycle clubs with veteran support programs nationwide. The idea had grown from watching his grandfather bridge the gap between generations through shared respect for riding. Mrs. Rodriguez, wiping tears from her eyes, presented a community photo album. Each page showed how Cedar Grove had changed. Steel Ravens members helping elderly residents with home repairs, organizing neighborhood watch programs, and creating safe riding programs for local youth. But the biggest surprise came from Mike and the Steel Ravens. They unveiled a new motorcycle, a restored Indian Scout, identical to Harold's. This bike, Mike announced, will be our club's legacy bike. Each year, it will be used to train new members, reminding them of the standards of excellence and service that Mr. Cooper taught us. Harold, overwhelmed by emotion, stood slowly. The room fell silent as he made his way to the podium. Despite his 94 years, he stood straight and proud, his voice clear as he addressed the gathering. "A year ago," he began, "I thought I was fighting against something. Instead, I found I was fighting for something, for community, for understanding, for the kind of brotherhood I knew during the war. The Steel Ravens have become more than I could have imagined. You've proven that it's never too late to change course, to choose respect over fear, service over selfishness." As if on cue, the rumble of motorcycles filled the air. Through the windows, everyone could see a long line of bikes approaching, riders from veteran support clubs across the country, come to pay their respects and learn from the Steel Ravens' example. Officer Jenkins, now a regular at club events, smiled at Harold. "You know, when I suggested you might want to move away, I never imagined you'd end up changing the whole community instead." The celebration continued into the evening, but with the respectful quiet that had become the Steel Ravens' trademark. Young riders sat with veterans, eagerly learning from their experiences. Children played safely in the streets, watched over by leather-clad guardians who had once been viewed with fear. As the sun set, Harold took one last ride on his Indian Scout, leading a formation of Steel Ravens through the streets of Cedar Grove. Residents came out of their homes to wave and cheer, recognizing that they were watching more than just a motorcycle parade. They were witnessing the final chapter of a story about transformation, respect, and the power of understanding. Back at his home, Harold parked his motorcycle in the garage next to his pristine Chevrolet. Tommy helped him remove his leather jacket, the one that bore both his World War II patches and his honorary Steel Ravens membership. "You know, Grandpa," Tommy said, "when I found those old photos, I thought I was just learning about your past. Instead, you showed us all how to build a better future." Harold smiled, looking out at his peaceful neighborhood where the sound of motorcycles no longer brought fear, but pride. "Sometimes," he replied, "the best way to honor the past is to use its lessons to change the present. The Steel Ravens learned that, and now they'll teach others." The story of the 93-year-old veteran and the motorcycle club had become more than just a tale of conflict resolved. It had become a legend of transformation, proving that it's never too late to make a difference in the world.